History is written by the victors, they say, but sometimes it's rewritten by the whispers behind palace walls. Imagine a world where a single secret, locked in the heart of a king or queen, could unravel empires, ignite rebellions, or erase a royal bloodline overnight. These aren't just scandals, they're the hidden gears that turn the machinery of history, toppling crowns and rewriting destinies in ways textbooks never dared to reveal. From forbidden love affairs that sparked wars to shocking betrayals buried for centuries, the truth behind royal secrets is far stranger and darker than any fairy tale. Think about it. What if the fall of a dynasty wasn't about battlefields, but a letter slipped into the wrong hands, or a royal birth shrouded in lies? For every throne that crumbled, there was often a secret so explosive it had to be suffocated. Until now. Today, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on 25 of the most jaw-dropping royal secrets that shook kingdoms to their core. These aren't just twists of fate, they're the moments when history held its breath, when a single revelation could mean the difference between a king's triumph and his execution. You're about to step into the shadowy corridors of power where whispers were deadlier than swords. We'll uncover how a queen's hidden illness changed the course of a nation, how a stolen crown jewel nearly sparked a war, and why some royals took their most dangerous secrets to the grave. This isn't just history, it's the untold drama that shaped our world, left out of the official records but burned into the legacy of empires. So settle in, because by the end of this journey, you'll never look at a royal portrait the same way again. The truth is waiting, and it's more thrilling than you ever imagined. In the chaos of the French Revolution, one mystery cut deeper than the fall of the monarchy: the fate of young Louis XVII, the boy king who vanished without a trace. Officially, the Dauphin died in prison at just 10 years old, wasted away by neglect in a dank cell. But whispers swirled for decades that he had escaped, spirited away by royalists who couldn't bear the thought of the last Bourbon heir perishing in the dark. Some claimed he grew up under an assumed name, living a quiet life far from the throne he was born to inherit. Others insisted impostors seized on the rumor, each claiming to be the lost prince, men who appeared with cryptic birthmarks or sudden knowledge of royal protocols, sparking frenzied hope in monarchists desperate for a restoration. The uncertainty alone became a weapon. Every claimant, whether genuine or fraud, forced France to relive its revolutionary wounds. Imagine the panic in government chambers when a man named Karl Wilhelm Naundorf arrived in Paris decades later, bearing scars said to match the Dauphin's childhood injuries, speaking flawless French, and recounting palace details no commoner could know. Even the exiled royal family split. Some denounced him, others quietly funded his lawsuits, terrified that if the public believed, it could reignite civil war. The truth might never be settled. When scientists tested a heart preserved as the Dauphin's, even DNA couldn't silence the skeptics. What's undeniable is how this single boy's disappearance haunted a nation. His ghost, real or imagined, became a symbol of everything France had lost and destroyed. Royalists clung to him as proof the revolution was a crime. Republicans used his supposed death to justify their cause, arguing even a child king was too dangerous to leave alive. And in the shadows, opportunists played both sides, turning a tragedy into a political chess game where the mere idea of his survival could topple governments. For decades, France wasn't just fighting over laws or land. It was fighting over a story, one that began with a question scribbled in secret letters and prison logs. Did the king's son ever really die? The chaos didn't end with whispers of Louis XVII's survival. It ignited a powder keg of rebellion and paranoia that outlived Napoleon himself. After the Bourbon monarchy was restored in 1814, every pretender who stepped forward claiming to be the lost Dauphin wasn't just a curiosity, he was a threat. Imagine the terror in King Louis XVIII's court when men like the so-called Dark Count, a shadowy figure who emerged in Germany, began gathering followers among royalist diehards who believed the throne had been stolen from its true heir. These weren't just impostors, they were lightning rods for dissent, their very existence fueling underground movements that plotted to overthrow the restored monarchy. From within, one of the most dangerous claimants, a watchmaker named Karl Wilhelm Naundorf, didn't just insist he was the Dauphin, he weaponized the myth. He penned detailed manifestos accusing Louis XVIII of knowingly usurping a throne that wasn't his. His followers weren't mere fanatics, they included disgruntled army officers and aristocrats who'd lost influence after the revolution. When Naundorf was expelled from France, his supporters allegedly planned to smuggle him back in, sparking rumors of a coup that would restore the true king. The royal court didn't just dismiss these claims, they hunted them. Secret police infiltrated Naundorf's circles, and at one point, a would-be assassin was caught near the claimant's home, armed with a dagger and a note condemning him as a traitor to the real Bourbon blood. But the darkest irony, the restored Bourbons, the very family that should have celebrated the Dauphin's survival, were trapped by the lie. To admit even the possibility he'd lived would unravel their legitimacy, painting them as usurpers. Yet to dismiss the rumors entirely risked alienating monarchists who saw the lost prince as a martyr. So they danced on a knife's edge, quietly funding scientific tests to debunk claimants while violently suppressing their movements. The government even went so far as to confiscate and destroy private letters discussing the Dauphin's fate, turning historical curiosity into a crime. This wasn't just about one boy, it was about who had the right to rule and how far a nation would go to bury its ghosts. Every time a new pretender emerged, France relived its revolution, its terror, its guilt. The Dauphin's ghost became a mirror, reflecting whatever people feared or longed for. To royalists, he was purity stolen by barbarians. To republicans, a reminder of the monarchy's fatal corruption. And in the shadows, the Bourbons lived with a chilling truth: some secrets don't stay buried, no matter how many times you try to seal the tomb. Anne Boleyn's downfall wasn't just about power, it was about a secret so shocking even Tudor England gasped. When Henry VIII accused his own wife of incest with her brother, George Boleyn, the charges didn't just end a marriage, they shattered England's religious foundations and stained the Boleyn name forever. But was any of it true, or was this the ultimate royal lie, crafted to destroy a queen who dared to defy her king? The accusations read like something from a feverish nightmare. Anne was charged with adultery with 5 men, including her brother, and even plotting the king's death. The details were grotesquely specific: secret meetings in palace chambers, whispered confessions, even claims she'd mocked Henry's insecurities in bed. Yet historians have long questioned the evidence. The trial relied heavily on coerced confessions, and one of the accused, court musician Mark Smeaton, was likely tortured into admitting guilt. Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided over her trial, signaling how deeply politics, not justice, drove the verdict. Henry's motives were brutally clear. After 7 years of marriage, Anne had failed to produce a male heir, delivering only the future Elizabeth I. Worse, she'd grown outspoken, challenging Henry's authority and allying with reformist factions undermining the Catholic Church, the very institution Henry had broken from to marry her. The incest charge wasn't just salacious, it was strategic. By painting Anne as morally monstrous, Henry could justify executing her without alienating Catholic Europe or provoking rebellion. Incest wasn't just a crime, it was an abomination, a sin so vile even the Pope couldn't intervene. But the fallout went beyond one queen's death. Anne's execution cemented England's Protestant break from Rome, as Henry seized church lands and crushed dissent under the guise of moral purging. The Boleyns, once the most powerful family in England, were obliterated. George executed on the same scaffold as Anne, their father dying in disgrace. And Henry, he married Jane Seymour just 11 days later, rewriting history as if Anne had never existed. Yet the whispers never died. Centuries later, Anne's reputation still swings between villain and victim. Was she a manipulative seductress or a brilliant woman caught in a king's tyranny? The truth might lie somewhere in the silence, the letters burned, the witnesses silenced, the secret fears of a king who couldn't bear to be wrong. One thing's certain, Henry didn't just kill Anne. He turned her into a ghost, haunting England's conscience long after the axe fell. The moment Anne Boleyn's head rolled, the Tudor court held its breath, not just for a queen's death, but for the bloodbath that would follow. Henry VIII didn't stop with Anne and her brother. He wiped out her entire faction, a political purge so thorough it reshaped England's power structure overnight. The Boleyns had been untouchable just months before, their influence stretching from the royal bedchamber to the halls of Parliament. Now their allies scattered like leaves in a storm, desperate to distance themselves or face the same fate. Take Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister and once Anne's staunch supporter. He'd helped engineer her rise, but as the axe loomed, he pivoted with chilling efficiency, overseeing her trial and even drafting the execution orders. It wasn't loyalty that saved him, it was ruthlessness. Yet even Cromwell wouldn't escape the fallout forever. Anne's destruction set a precedent. No one was safe, not even the architects of the king's will. Then there were the lesser players, the Boleyn-affiliated bishops, the courtiers who jostled for her favor. Overnight, they found themselves exiled, imprisoned, or stripped of titles. Henry's message was clear: dissent wouldn't be tolerated, and past loyalty meant nothing. The incest accusations weren't just about smearing Anne. They tainted everyone connected to her, painting her entire circle as morally suspect. This vacuum didn't stay empty for long. Enter Jane Seymour, the quiet, conservative opposite of Anne's fiery defiance. Where Anne had pushed religious reform and political ambition, Jane offered docility and tradition. Her rise wasn't just a personal victory, it was a counter-revolution. The Seymour family, once overshadowed by the Boleyns, now seized power, filling the void with their own allies. But the most chilling effect, the silence that followed. Anne's name was scrubbed from official records, her portraits destroyed. Even her daughter, Elizabeth, was declared illegitimate. The court learned its lesson: cross the king, and you wouldn't just die, you'd be erased. The Boleyn faction's fall wasn't just a shift in power. It was a warning carved in blood, one that echoed through every whispered conversation in the palace for years to come. Rasputin wasn't just a mystic, he was a time bomb ticking at the heart of Imperial Russia. When Tsarina Alexandra invited the self-proclaimed holy man into her inner circle, she saw a healer who could save her hemophiliac son, Alexei. But to the Russian people, he became the shadow ruler of an empire, a peasant with his fingers tangled in the strings of the Romanov dynasty. The scandal wasn't just his presence, it was the devastating truth that a woman who'd once been the most powerful figure in Russia now whispered state secrets to a man the court called the Dark One. His influence bled into politics with terrifying speed. Ministers were appointed or dismissed on his whim, battlefield strategies were altered after his visions, and he openly bragged that the Tsar clasped his hand like a supplicant. When Nicholas II left for the front during World War I, Rasputin's grip tightened. Alexandra, desperate and isolated, forwarded his cryptic notes to her husband as divine guidance. One such letter urged delaying a critical military offensive, a decision that cost thousands of lives and deepened public fury. But the real powder keg wasn't Rasputin's power, it was the rumors of how he used it. Whispers of orgies in the royal palace, of the Tsarina's handwritten letters addressing him as "my beloved," of midnight meetings where state policies were decided between drunken sermons. The aristocracy recoiled, the clergy called him a heretic. Even as Russia starved and soldiers died in the trenches, the royal family seemed more obsessed with a mystic's prophecies than their crumbling nation. Revolutionaries seized on the scandal like wolves scenting blood. Pamphlets circulated with forged letters, proving Alexandra and Rasputin were German spies. Cartoons depicted the monk looming over the Tsar's throne, pulling his strings like a puppet. The message was irresistible. If Russia's rulers were this corrupt, didn't they deserve to fall? When nobles finally assassinated Rasputin in 1916, poisoning, shooting, and drowning him in a frozen river, they thought they were saving the monarchy. Instead, they exposed its fatal weakness. The Tsar's refusal to condemn the murder made him look complicit. Alexandra's public grief seemed proof of an unholy alliance. Within months, protests erupted, Nicholas abdicated, and the Romanovs became prisoners in their own palace. Rasputin's last prophecy, scribbled before his death, haunted them all. "If I perish, you will lose your son and your crown within 2 years." He was off by 17 days. The night they killed Rasputin wasn't just murder, it was theater, a desperate performance by nobles who believed they were staging Russia's salvation. Prince Felix Yusupov, the flamboyant aristocrat who led the plot, lured Rasputin to his palace under the pretense of meeting his beautiful wife. What followed was a grotesque spectacle: cakes laced with enough cyanide to kill 5 men, wine glasses dusted with poison, and when the monk still wouldn't die, bullets fired into his back at point-blank range. Yusupov's own memoirs read like a horror story: Rasputin staggering up from the floor, choking on his own blood, whispering, "You bad boy," before collapsing into the snow. But the cover-up was even more damning than the crime. Instead of silencing rumors, the killers fed them. Yusupov boasted to reporters, turning the assassination into a public spectacle. The Tsar's response: a slap on the wrist, exiling Yusupov to his country estate, a punishment so light it reeked of approval. For ordinary Russians, already starving and war-weary, the message was unmistakable. The aristocracy could butcher a peasant in cold blood and face no consequences. Worse, Nicholas's refusal to condemn the murder tied him to it, making the monarchy look complicit in the very depravity it had tolerated for years. The fallout was immediate. Soldiers at the front, hearing of Rasputin's death, openly cheered not for the Tsar but for his killers. Priests who'd called the monk a devil now warned his martyrdom would curse the Romanovs. And in the streets, whispers spread like wildfire. If the Tsarina's holy friend could be slaughtered in a noble's basement, how long until the whole rotten system collapsed? Just weeks later, when bread riots erupted in Petrograd, the symbols were everywhere. Protesters carried signs with Rasputin's face, framing him as both victim and villain, proof of the court's corruption. Soldiers ordered to fire on the crowds instead joined them, echoing Yusupov's defiance. The murder hadn't saved the monarchy. It had exposed its hollow core, showing the world that Russia's rulers would rather drown in blood than change. By the time Nicholas abdicated, even his own generals cited Rasputin's influence as justification. The monk's corpse, weighted with chains and sunk beneath the ice, had become an anchor dragging the Romanovs down with him. The Tower of London has seen countless prisoners walk through its gates, but none left a stain on English history quite like the disappearance of 2 young princes. In the summer of 1483, 12-year-old Edward V and his 9-year-old brother Richard vanished without a trace, their uncle Richard III taking the throne just weeks later. Officially, they were sent to the Tower for protection, but within months the whispers began had the new king ordered their murders to secure his crown. The timing couldn't have been more damning. Richard had been named Lord Protector when his brother, King Edward IV, died unexpectedly, but within a shockingly short time he declared Edward's marriage invalid, rendering the princes illegitimate and himself the rightful heir. Parliament rubber-stamped his claim, and the boys were last seen playing near the Tower's gardens before they simply disappeared. No funeral, no explanation, just silence. By the time Henry Tudor defeated Richard at Bosworth Field 2 years later, the rumors had hardened into accepted fact. Richard III was a child killer, the monstrous uncle who'd butchered his own blood. But here's where the secret twists. For centuries, there was no physical proof, just Tudor propaganda painting Richard as a deformed, murderous tyrant. Shakespeare immortalized the image, depicting him as a hunchbacked villain who'd smother the princes in their sleep. Then, in 1674, workers renovating the tower stumbled upon a wooden chest buried beneath a staircase. Inside were two small skeletons, hastily hidden. The bones matched the princes' ages, but without modern forensics, the truth remained buried with them. The Tudors had every reason to amplify the horror. Henry VII's claim to the throne was paper-thin. He was a distant Lancastrian relative who'd won his crown on the battlefield. By vilifying Richard, he turned his own reign into a moral crusade, a deliverance from a usurper's bloody hands. Court historians rewrote the narrative, erasing nuance and cementing Richard's guilt in the public mind. Even the discovery of the bones was weaponized. Charles II had them interred in Westminster Abbey as martyrs, a permanent indictment of Richard's reign. Yet doubts linger. Some historians argue the princes could have died naturally, their bodies hidden to avoid fueling rebellions. Others point to Henry Tudor himself. After all, eliminating the last Yorkist heirs secured his dynasty far more than Richard's. Without DNA proof linking the skeletons to the princes, the mystery endures. But one thing's certain, this secret didn't just end a king's reputation. It built an empire, giving the Tudors the moral high ground to rule England for over a century. Richard's legacy wasn't written in history, it was buried beneath a staircase, waiting for the right moment to be found. For years, the ghosts of the lost princes haunted Henry VII's reign until one of them supposedly walked out of the shadows. In 1491, a young man named Perkin Warbeck appeared in Ireland, claiming to be Richard of York, the younger of the vanished Tower princes. His story was audacious. He'd been smuggled to safety, raised in secret across Europe, and now returned to reclaim his stolen crown. What followed wasn't just a royal deception. It was a masterclass in political theater that exposed just how fragile England's new dynasty really was. Warbeck's timing couldn't have been more dangerous. Henry VII's grip on power was still shaky, his Tudor line just 6 years old. The boy's uncanny resemblance to Edward IV, combined with his polished manners and eerie knowledge of court life, made even hardened skeptics pause. Crowds flocked to see him in Cork, where locals still loyal to the Yorkist cause crowned him King Richard IV in a makeshift ceremony. Soon, powerful European monarchs took notice. Margaret of York, the real prince's aunt and a die-hard Yorkist schemer, welcomed Warbeck to her court in Burgundy, declaring him her long-lost nephew. Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I went further, funding his campaign and signing treaties in his name. Henry's response, panic disguised as fury. He tightened surveillance on nobles with Yorkist ties, executed potential conspirators, and even imposed trade embargoes on Burgundy to strangle Warbeck's support. But the deeper terror was this: Henry knew his own claim was built on conquest, not blood. If people believed just one Yorkist heir had survived, his entire reign could unravel. The climax came in 1497 when Warbeck landed in Cornwall with a ragtag army. Though his rebellion crumbled, the mere fact he'd reached English soil sent tremors through the realm. After his capture, Henry faced a dilemma: execute him and risk turning him into a martyr, or keep him alive, inviting endless plots. He chose humiliation. Warbeck was paraded through London, forced to confess his true identity as a Flemish boatman's son, a script likely written under torture, but even in chains the damage was done. Henry's paranoia spiraled. He created England's first secret police, planting spies in noble households. Warbeck's final act was the strangest. After years in the Tower, he was hanged alongside another Yorkist claimant, their bodies left to rot as a warning. Yet the whispers never died. Some insisted Henry killed him precisely because he was the real prince. Others noted grimly that the king's own son, Arthur, died mysteriously soon after, as if the Tudors, too, were cursed by the boys in the tower. Whether fraud or legitimate, Warbeck proved one thing. In the Game of Thrones, a secret could be deadlier than an army. Catherine II didn't just inherit an empire, she stole one, with a web of secrets so tightly woven that by the time her husband realized the danger, it was already at his throat. Peter III's reign lasted barely 6 months before his own wife orchestrated his overthrow, but the coup wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. It was the crescendo of years of whispered conversations, clandestine letters, and calculated alliances, all hidden behind the mask of a dutiful spouse. The irony was delicious. Peter, infatuated with Prussia's Frederick the Great, had alienated Russia's military by dressing troops in Prussian uniforms and gifting territory back to Berlin. Meanwhile, Catherine, born a minor German princess, studied Russian orthodoxy, mastered the language, and courted the elite with a charm her brutish husband lacked. While Peter paraded his mistresses and slurred through drunken speeches, Catherine hosted salons, debating philosophy with generals and bishops. Her greatest weapon wasn't an army, it was the quiet certainty she planted in every influential mind: Russia deserved better. Then came the letters. Dozens survive, revealing a shadow government conducted in ink. To her lover Grigory Orlov, a dashing guardsman with ties to the military, she wrote of patience and preparations, hinting at rewards for loyalty. To the formidable Princess Dashkova, she lamented Peter's childish follies, framing herself as Russia's reluctant savior. Even Frederick the Great, Peter's idol, received secret missives, Catherine assuring him she'd honor their treaties, subtly undercutting her husband's authority. Every word was a thread, and by July 1762 she'd woven a noose. The final act was lightning fast, when Peter vacationed at a palace outside St. Petersburg. Catherine rode to the capital with Orlov's brothers, who rallied the regiments. By dawn, the Senate and clergy swore allegiance to her. Peter, scrambling to respond, found his orders ignored. His generals had been Catherine's confidants for years. Arrested and forced to abdicate, he died days later in official captivity, though rumors swirled Orlov's brothers strangled him. Catherine never confirmed it, but she didn't deny it either. The message was clear: cross her, and even an emperor's crown wouldn't save you. But the true masterstroke came after. Catherine didn't just seize power, she rewrote the story. Pamphlets painted Peter as a drunkard and traitor, her coup as a patriotic duty. She commissioned portraits of herself as Minerva, goddess of wisdom, while Peter's image vanished from coins and monuments. And those letters that plotted his downfall, she kept them, sealing some in archives, burning others, leaving just enough evidence to remind the ambitious what happened to those who underestimated her. Her reign became Europe's longest, a golden age of expansion and art. Yet beneath the glittering surface, the lesson lingered. The deadliest revolutions aren't fought in the streets, but in private chambers where a whispered promise can topple a throne. Peter lost his empire because he forgot the first rule of monarchy: love is fleeting, but secrets are forever. Catherine the Great didn't just overthrow her husband, she staged his downfall like a playwright crafting the perfect tragedy. Days before the coup, a peculiar rumor began circulating through St. Petersburg's salons and barracks. Peter III had fallen gravely ill. The timing was no accident. By planting whispers of his frailty, Catherine softened the shock of his sudden removal, framing her power grab as an inevitable transition rather than a violent usurpation. The genius of this lie wasn't just in its deception, it was in its plausibility. Peter's erratic behavior, his public drunkenness, even his reported convulsions after heavy meals made the story easy to swallow. When the official announcement finally came that he'd abdicated due to failing health, few questioned it, but the narrative required more than mere gossip. Catherine orchestrated a full-scale propaganda campaign, using carefully curated letters and staged public appearances to sell the illusion. One surviving account describes her arriving at the Winter Palace draped in mourning black, her face veiled though Peter was still very much alive, pacing a cell in Shropshire. The theatrics worked. By the time news broke of his death from hemorrhoidal colic, a diagnosis so absurd it invited skepticism, the public had already accepted his downfall as fate. Even foreign ambassadors trained to spot subterfuge reported to their courts that the emperor had succumbed to natural causes. This wasn't just cover for a murder, it was a blueprint. Future Russian power grabs would follow Catherine's template, from the mysterious demise of Paul I, smothered with a pillow after resisting abdication, to the suicide of Nicholas II's trusted minister, Pyotr Stolypin, shot at the opera in front of the Tsar. The lesson was clear. In Russia, rulers didn't just die, they were edited out of history. Their endings were written to serve the next regime. Catherine's masterstroke, though, was turning Peter's erasure into her own origin story. She commissioned portraits depicting her as the grieving widow turned savior, a narrative that glossed over the blood on her hands. Playwrights penned flattering dramas about her divine mission to rule, while Peter's name faded into footnotes. Years later, when a pretender emerged claiming to be the resurrected Peter, Catherine didn't bother with denials. She had him flogged and sent to Siberia, a blunt reminder that in her Russia, the truth was whatever the crown declared it to be. The fake illness, the staged grief, the absurd cause of death. Each layer of deception reinforced a brutal truth. Power wasn't taken through strength alone, but through stories so compelling they became history. Catherine didn't just seize a throne, she authored its legend, proving that in the game of empires, the pen and the like could be deadlier than the sword. The Habsburg dynasty didn't just rule Europe, they nearly choked on their own blood. For over 2 centuries, their signature feature, the infamous Habsburg Jaw, became a grotesque symbol of royal power gone terribly wrong. That protruding chin, those misshapen lips, the jutting lower teeth, it wasn't just a quirk of genetics, it was the unmasked cost of an obsession with keeping power locked within the family, no matter the consequences. The scandal wasn't just the deformities, it was the deliberate denial. Generation after generation, Habsburgs married their cousins, uncles, nieces, sometimes even closer relatives, convinced that pure royal blood meant divine right to rule. But biology had other plans. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the damage was irreversible. His tongue was so swollen he could barely speak. His jaw jutted so far forward he couldn't chew. Epileptic, mentally disabled, and barely able to walk without assistance, he became known as El Hechizado, the bewitched, a monarch so physically broken his own courtiers crossed themselves when he entered a room. Yet the real tragedy wasn't Charles's suffering, it was how his family enabled it. His parents were uncle and niece, a marriage approved by the Pope himself. His grandfather, Philip III, had such severe drooling issues servants held napkins beneath his chin during state dinners. But the dynasty kept doubling down, convinced that outsiders posed a greater threat than their own collapsing gene pool. The political fallout was catastrophic. Charles's inability to produce an heir, likely due to genetic infertility, triggered the War of Spanish Succession, tearing Europe apart for 13 years. When he died in 1700, his autopsy report read like a horror story. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten. The Habsburgs had sacrificed an empire on the altar of blood purity, proving that when you mistake incest for tradition, the throne itself becomes a gilded coffin. But here's the darkest irony. Their obsession with the Habsburg chin as a mark of legitimacy became their undoing. Portraits of earlier generations show only slight jaw protrusion, proud, strong rulers. Yet later paintings hide nothing, the distorted faces, the vacant stares. Art historians note how court painters began strategically draping subjects' necks or angling their profiles to soften the deformities. The very trait they'd bred to signify power had become a punchline in royal courts across Europe. Science now confirms the damage. Modern genetic analysis of Charles II's ancestry found his inbreeding coefficient higher than if he'd been born to siblings, a biological time bomb his ancestors spent centuries building. The Habsburgs didn't just lose Spain because of war or politics. They lost it because they forgot the simplest truth: no crown is strong enough to outlast the weight of its own blood. Charles II's body wasn't just failing him, it was failing an empire. By the time he reached adulthood, the Spanish court was trapped in a grotesque waiting game, watching their king stumble through rituals he barely understood while diplomats across Europe placed bets on when his frail body would finally give out. But the real crisis wasn't his epilepsy or his inability to chew. It was the secret whispered in royal chambers from Madrid to Vienna: this broken man would never father an heir. The Habsburgs had spent centuries weaving a web of intermarriage so tight they'd tied their own noose. The panic began long before Charles's reign. For generations, Habsburg princesses had been shipped between Vienna and Madrid like genetic bargaining chips, their wombs treated as vaults for preserving pure blood. Charles's own parents, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece, a marriage so closely linked that their son inherited not one but two copies of the same catastrophic recessive genes. By the time Charles married twice, first to his French cousin Marie-Louise, then to his German cousin Maria Anna, his sperm count was likely non-existent. Court physicians documented his weakness with euphemisms, but the truth was written in the empty royal nursery. Then came the dynastic free-for-all. With no clear heir, Europe's powers circled like vultures. France's Louis XIV, married to Charles's half-sister, claimed the throne for his grandson Philip. Austria's Leopold I, another Habsburg cousin, pushed his own son Charles as successor. Even Bavaria tossed its hat in the ring, backing a distant nephew. The Spanish court split into warring factions, one flying French flags, the other hanging Austrian banners from palace windows. Charles, barely coherent, was paraded through the halls like a puppet, forced to sign conflicting wills under pressure from rival camps. When he finally died in November 1700, the explosion was instantaneous. Louis XIV moved French troops into the Spanish Netherlands. England and Austria formed a grand alliance to stop him, and for 13 years, battlefields from Italy to the Americas ran red with blood. The war reshaped continents. Gibraltar fell to the British, Spain lost its Italian territories, and the once mighty Habsburg grip on Europe began to crumble. But the cruelest twist, modern geneticists confirm Charles's infertility was almost certainly preventable. Outbreeding, just one marriage to a non-relative in the previous 5 generations, could have diluted the deadly recessive traits. Instead, the Habsburgs chose dynasty over destiny, clinging to incest like a life raft even as it drowned their line. Their last Spanish king wasn't bewitched by magic, but by centuries of arrogance, a living monument to the lie that blood alone makes a ruler. In the end, the war wasn't just about succession, it was about a family so terrified of sharing power, they'd rather watch their own flesh and blood wither than loosen their grip. Marie Antoinette never even touched the infamous diamond necklace, yet it became the noose around her reputation. The scandal began with a con artist named Jean de la Motte, a cunning social climber who spun a web of forgery and deception so elaborate it fooled cardinals, jewelers, and nearly toppled the French monarchy. At its heart was a staggering piece of jewelry, a diamond-encrusted collar worth 1.6 million livres, enough to feed thousands of starving Parisians for months. Jean's scheme: convince a gullible cardinal that the Queen secretly desired the necklace but needed him to broker the purchase discreetly. Here's the twist: Marie Antoinette had already refused the necklace twice, calling it vulgar excess. She despised the cardinal, who'd spread rumors about her alleged affairs. Yet Jean exploited these very tensions, forging letters in the Queen's handwriting and arranging midnight meetings in palace gardens with a prostitute disguised as Marie. When the jewelers finally demanded payment, the whole house of cards collapsed, but not before the public became convinced their queen had squandered a fortune on jewels while they starved. The trial that followed was less about justice and more about spectacle. The cardinal was acquitted, Jean lightly punished, and Marie Antoinette, though innocent, emerged as the villain. Pamphlets depicted her laughing atop a mountain of diamonds, ignoring peasants begging for bread. The timing couldn't have been worse. France teetered on bankruptcy, harvests had failed, and now here was proof of royal decadence. The necklace became shorthand for everything wrong with the monarchy: its detachment, its excess, its lies. Historians later uncovered the truth, but by then the damage was irreversible. The affair didn't just stain Marie's reputation, it radicalized the masses. When the Bastille fell 3 years later, rioters carried cartoons of the Queen clutching the phantom necklace, her neck now literally on the line. The real crime wasn't theft, it was how easily the people believed their Queen could betray them. In the end, the diamonds were fake, but the outrage was all too real. The Cardinal de Rohan didn't just fall for Jean de la Motte's trap. He saw an opportunity to climb out of his own disgrace. For years, the Prince Bishop had been exiled from Versailles after spreading salacious gossip about Marie Antoinette's supposed affairs. But the diamond necklace scheme offered him a golden ticket back into the Queen's favor, or so he believed. When Jean whispered that Marie Antoinette secretly longed for the necklace but needed a discreet intermediary, Rohan didn't just bite, he dove headfirst into the conspiracy, desperate to prove his loyalty. What followed was a masterclass in courtly manipulation. Rohan emptied his coffers to pay the jeweler's deposit, even borrowing from shady lenders to cover the staggering sum. He staged a clandestine midnight meeting in the palace of Versailles Gardens, where a veiled prostitute posed as the Queen, murmuring fabricated gratitude. The cardinal, blinded by ambition, missed every red flag. The misspelled forged letters, the Queen's well-known disdain for excessive jewels, even Jean's brazen demand for a cut of the deal. His eagerness to believe wasn't just naivety, it was political calculus. The French court was a snake pit of factions, and Rohan wagered that delivering the necklace would humiliate the Queen's enemies while securing his redemption. But the real power play came when the scheme unraveled. As jewelers demanded payment and Jean's forgeries were exposed, Rohan didn't grovel, he pivoted. At his trial, his defense wasn't merely innocence, it was victimhood. He painted himself as a devout servant duped by criminals, subtly implicating the Queen's reputation by detailing the private correspondence he believed genuine. The courtroom gasped as prosecutors read aloud the fake letters laced with intimate language no royal would ever pen. Marie Antoinette, forced to testify, seethed as her name was dragged through the mud without uttering a word. The verdict was a slap in the face to the monarchy. Rohan was acquitted amid public cheers, while Jean received a light punishment, branding and imprisonment, from which she promptly escaped to London to publish tell-all memoirs. The message was clear: the nobility would protect one of their own, even at the Queen's expense. Versailles factions had weaponized the scandal, using Rohan's humiliation to expose the crown's crumbling authority. By the time the mob stormed the Bastille, Marie Antoinette wasn't just hated for her extravagance, she was seen as weak, outmaneuvered by the very courtiers meant to obey her. The necklace had vanished, but the damage was eternal. Edward VIII didn't just abdicate the British throne for love, he traded it for a fantasy of power far darker than anyone imagined. While the world fixated on his scandalous romance with Wallis Simpson, a far more dangerous secret was unfolding behind closed doors. Long after his exile to France, the former king was courting Nazi leaders, exchanging confidential military details, and even drafting plans for a puppet monarchy under Hitler's thumb. This wasn't just a personal disgrace, it was a betrayal so profound it forced Buckingham Palace to rewrite history to survive. The evidence is chilling. Declassified documents reveal Edward met Hitler in 1937 at Berchtesgaden, saluting the Führer with a raised arm before hours of private conversation. German Foreign Ministry memos describe him praising Nazi labor camps as marvelous and declaring Britain's alliance with France a disaster, but the real bombshell. British intelligence intercepted letters showing Edward fed German diplomats troop movements and cabinet disputes during the war while officially serving as governor of the Bahamas. His motive, a delusional belief that if Britain fell, Hitler would restore him to the throne with Wallis as queen. Winston Churchill knew, so did George VI. The monarchy's survival depended on containing the scandal, so they orchestrated a cover-up worthy of a spy novel. Edward's wartime letters were seized under royal privilege, his phone lines tapped, his every move shadowed by MI5 agents. When he drunkenly blurted to guests that London would be bombed into submission just before the Blitz, Churchill banished him to the Caribbean, far from prying journalists. The royal family went further, erasing Edward from official portraits, scrubbing his name from documents, even locking away his abdication speech in the archives. The fallout reshaped the crown forever. Edward's treachery became the unspoken reason the post-war monarchy rebranded itself as the family of the people, distancing from European ties and leaning into humble symbolism. Queen Elizabeth II's famed restraint, a direct reaction to her uncle's reckless ego. The modern royal's aversion to politics, a lesson learned from a king who nearly sold his country for a crown. But the deepest wound was personal. Letters show George VI, already battling cancer and the weight of war, confided to his wife that Edward's actions were worse than murder. The brothers never reconciled. When Edward returned for their mother's funeral in 1952, he was barred from sitting with the family. History remembers him as the king who chose love over duty. The archives tell a darker truth, a man who chose tyranny over his own blood. The Windsor files weren't just secret, they were a ticking time bomb buried in the heart of the British Empire. Declassified decades later, they reveal Edward VIII's frantic attempts to broker a deal with Nazi Germany, not out of naive sympathy, but with one chilling goal: to reclaim his stolen throne. His plan was as audacious as it was treasonous. As war loomed in 1939, Edward and Wallis Simpson embarked on a private European tour, but diplomatic cables tell a different story. In Berlin, he met Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, and allegedly handed over French defense plans, details he'd gleaned from high-ranking military contacts during his brief reign. The files even suggest he promised to rally British aristocrats against Churchill if Germany installed him as a puppet king post-invasion. But the most damning evidence came from Lisbon in 1940. Stranded in neutral Portugal after France fell, Edward wasn't just waiting out the war, he was scheming. British spies intercepted his letters to Nazi officials, one stating England would never survive without surrendering to Hitler. Worse, he'd stored sensitive documents in a French bank vault, including maps of Allied fortifications. When Churchill got wind of it, he didn't just exile Edward to Bermuda, he turned the Duke's own staff into informants. Servants reported his drunken rants about Churchill's stupidity, while MI5 agents hid microphones in his Nassau mansion, capturing every whispered conversation with pro-Nazi visitors. The royal family's panic was palpable. George VI, already shouldering the burdens of war, privately called his brother the traitor in the family. Palace aides burned correspondence, fearing Edward's name in German hands could demoralize the nation. Even his beloved Fort Belvedere, the estate where he'd signed his abdication, was stripped of valuables not for protection but to erase his legacy. Yet history might never have learned the full truth if not for a slip-up in 1957. Edward, now a bitter exile in Paris, gave an interview praising Hitler's charm. The press erupted, forcing the government to release sanitized fragments of his wartime files. But the real smoking gun emerged in 2009, when a German historian uncovered Ribbentrop's personal memo on Edward. He believes the British people will recall him once they suffer enough. The irony, the man who gave up a crown for love spent the rest of his life plotting to steal it back, with the blood of his own countrymen as the price. Cleopatra didn't just charm her enemies, she weaponized hospitality, turning generosity into a fatal trap. Ancient historians whispered of her arsenal of poisoned gifts, each designed to remove obstacles with a smile. Take the legendary comb laced with venom, supposedly handed to her rebellious sister Arsinoe with a sisterly embrace, or the basket of figs hiding not fruit but the deadly asp that would later end her own life, a tool she'd allegedly tested on prisoners first. This wasn't just murder, it was theater, a performance of regal benevolence that masked calculated brutality. The genius of her methods lay in their deniability. When King Herod's brother, Aristobulus, drowned during a friendly visit to Alexandria, Rome's senators scoffed at the idea of foul play until rumors surfaced that Cleopatra's physicians had prescribed him a healing bath in perfumed oils laced with a paralytic. No blades, no screams, just a body floating in opulence, its death as ambiguous as her intentions. Even her love affairs doubled as strategic eliminations. Poisoned lip balm, tainted wine cups, every intimate gesture carried the potential for betrayal. Yet her most audacious ploy targeted Mark Antony's rivals. Plutarch recounts how, during a feast for enemy generals, she gifted golden cups smeared with a slow-acting toxin. As the victims celebrated their honor, the poison seeped in, ensuring their deaths days later, far from her palace with no witnesses. The message was clear: cross Cleopatra, and even your triumph would be your last. Modern toxicologists confirm her methods were terrifyingly plausible. Egyptian alchemists had mastered extracting venom from snakes and refining lethal botanicals like hemlock and wolfsbane. A scroll recovered from Alexandria's ruins even details how to distill aconite into a scentless powder, perfect for dusting on jewelry or scrolls. But the ultimate irony, Rome painted Cleopatra as a decadent sorceress while quietly adopting her tactics. Emperor Augustus banned poisons publicly, then allegedly used them on his own family. The Queen's true legacy wasn't just her deaths, but the precedent she set. In politics, the sweetest gifts often carry the sharpest sting. The story we've been told is a lie. Cleopatra's suicide wasn't a defiant act of love. It was a carefully staged execution, one meant to silence her forever while preserving Rome's propaganda machine. The official story claims she clasped an asp to her breast, choosing death over humiliation in Augustus's triumph, but the details unravel under scrutiny. Why would a queen who'd spent her life outmaneuvering enemies suddenly surrender without a fight? Why were there no bite marks on her body when attendants found her? And why did Augustus rush to display her corpse in gold robes, as if proving she died willingly? The truth is colder. Cleopatra was too dangerous to live. Consider the timeline. In her final days, she wasn't some heartbroken widow. She was negotiating. Roman historians admit she'd secretly sent her son Caesarion away, likely to rally loyalist forces in Upper Egypt. She'd also been stockpiling exotic poisons, not for suicide but as weapons. Augustus knew she could reignite resistance with a single order, and then there's the suicide note. Allegedly, she sent a letter to Augustus before her death, yet its contents mysteriously vanished from records. What if it wasn't a farewell but a threat? The physical evidence is even damning. Ancient accounts describe her body as unblemished, with no swelling or puncture wounds from an asp's bite. Asp venom causes agonizing, convulsive deaths, yet Cleopatra was reportedly serene, even regal in death. Poison, possibly, but here's the twist. Her handmaidens Charmian and Eras died with her, their bodies arranged as if in a tableau. Suicide pacts don't require staging. Murders do. Augustus had motive, means, and opportunity. He'd already executed Caesarion, hunted down Antony's allies, and erased Cleopatra's name from monuments. Letting her life risked her becoming a martyr. Letting her die by her own hand made her a cautionary tale. So he crafted the perfect ending, a lovesick queen so broken by loss she embraced the serpent. The myth stuck because it served Rome, and because dead women tell no tales, but the greatest proof of foul play, Augustus's own panic afterward. He burned Cleopatra's letters, banned depictions of her death, and even executed her physician, the one man who could have revealed how she really died. The Asp story wasn't history. It was the original cover-up, a murder disguised as poetry. And 2,000 years later, we're still reciting Rome's version of events, forgetting that victors don't just write history, they sanitize it. The Borgia name still sends shivers down spines centuries later, not because of their power, but because of how casually they turned dinner into a death sentence. Pope Alexander VI didn't just lead the Catholic Church, he ran it like a mafia family with his infamous Cantarella, poison as the silent enforcer. This wasn't some crude toxin, it was a refined, nearly untraceable weapon, rumored to be a blend of arsenic and decomposed boar flesh, its sweetness masking the murder in every bite. And the delivery method, lavish Vatican banquets where rival cardinals would toast to their host's health only to collapse hours later, their organs liquefying in agony. The genius of Alexander's scheme lay in its theatricality. Invitations to his meals were marks of favor, making refusal an insult. Guests would arrive to find golden plates heaped with delicacies, wine flowing like water, and the Pope's own son Cessair watching intently to see who sampled which dish. One notorious evening in 1497, Alexander hosted 3 wealthy cardinals desperate for church promotions. By dawn, all 3 were dead, their estates donated to the Vatican. Another time, a servant accidentally drank from the wrong chalice. When he dropped convulsing to the floor, Alexander merely sighed. God has called him, and signaled for the next course. But the darkest twist, the Borgias' weaponized confession. Victims often lingered just long enough to summon priests who, loyal to the family, would extract deathbed bequests to the church before administering last rites. Even the poison's name was a sick joke. Cantarella sounded like cantarella, the Italian word for a sweet little song. The message was clear: in the Borgias' Rome, even mercy had a price. Modern forensic tests on exhumed Borgia-era corpses revealed traces of arsenic so high they'd kill a man 3 times over. Yet the real horror wasn't the poison, it was the precedent. Alexander proved holiness could be a disguise, that a pope's robes could hide an assassin's dagger. When reformers later demanded church transparency, they weren't just fighting corruption. They were fighting the ghost of a man who turned communion wine into venom and the Vatican itself into a hunting ground. Lucrezia Borgia wasn't just a bride, she was a bargaining chip dipped in venom. At just 13, her first marriage was annulled when her father, Pope Alexander VI, found a more lucrative alliance. By her 3rd wedding, the pattern was clear. Every husband who stood in the Borgias' way met a grisly end, while Lucrezia's dowry swelled with land stripped from their corpses. This wasn't romance, it was realpolitik with a wedding veil. Take her 2nd husband, Alfonso of Aragon. The match secured Naples' loyalty until the Borgias needed his kingdom. Months after the wedding, assassins stabbed Alfonso in St. Peter's Square, leaving him bleeding on the basilica steps. Miraculously, he survived. Then came the recovery. Housed in the Vatican, attended by Alexander's personal physicians, the young duke slowly weakened, his body failing despite round-the-clock care. When he finally died, Lucrezia, conveniently widowed, was free to marry Alfonso d'Este, a union that gifted the papacy Ferrara's strategic lands. Coincidence? The Este family didn't think so. They insisted on taste testers for every meal and slept with armed guards. Even Lucrezia's reputation as a poisoner might have been a smokescreen. Chronicles paint her slipping lethal powders into rivals' wine, but letters reveal a more complex truth. She once intervened to spare a disgraced courtier, writing, "Blood enough has been shed." Some historians argue she was less a murderess than a pawn. Her infamous vanity cases of perfumes and powders deliberately exaggerated to distract from her father and brother's butchery. The darkest twist, the Borgias turned marriage vows into death sentences. When Lucrezia's first husband refused to annul their union, he was found strangled in his cell, officially a suicide despite his hands being bound. Her third spouse, the Duke of Ferrara, survived only by keeping Lucrezia close, betting correctly that even the Borgias wouldn't kill her in front of their children. By the time Lucrezia died in childbirth at 39, she'd outlived most of her enemies and all of her husbands. The lands she'd inherited through widowhood formed the backbone of the Papal States for centuries. The Borgias didn't just use poison, they weaponized the sacrament of marriage itself, turning holy matrimony into a slow-release toxin. And Lucrezia, she remains history's most enigmatic femme fatale, both the bait and the blade in her family's ruthless rise. The most famous prisoner in French history wasn't just locked away, he was erased, his face hidden behind a mask of black velvet so not even his jailers could glimpse his identity. The man in the Iron Mask remains one of history's most tantalizing riddles. A captive so dangerous, King Louis XIV ordered him buried in an unmarked grave under a false name, his very existence scrubbed from official records. But who was he? The theories span from the absurd to the explosive, each more gripping than the last. Some whispered he was Louis's illegitimate half-brother, born from a secret affair between Queen Anne and a nobleman. Others claimed he was the king's identical twin, hidden at birth to prevent a crisis of succession, a living, breathing threat to the Sun King's divine right to rule. The most chilling suggestion, he might have been Louis's true older brother, secretly swapped at birth after a stillbirth, only to resurface decades later demanding his stolen throne. The few surviving details only deepen the mystery. Prison logs describe a man of noble bearing, treated with eerie deference by his guards. He wore his mask even during meals, its hinges fastened with locks that clicked like a coffin sealing shut. When he died in 1703, every scrap of his belongings, even the clothes on his back, were burned. The prison's chaplain, who heard his final confession, was transferred to a remote monastery within hours. But this wasn't just a personal vendetta. The mask was a masterpiece of political theater. By vanishing a man without a name, Louis demonstrated absolute power, the ability to rewrite reality itself. No trial, no charges, just a living ghost rotting in the Bastille as a warning to anyone who might challenge the crown. Even Voltaire, decades later, wrote that the prisoner's existence proved the king could make a man disappear with a wave of his hand. The truth may never surface. Louis's descendants burned stacks of sensitive correspondence, and the few documents that survived refer to the prisoner only as the ancient prisoner or the nameless one. But the legend outlasted the monarchy. When revolutionaries stormed the Bastille in 1789, one of their first demands was to find the mask's wearer, proof that even in death, the king's darkest secret still held France in its grip. Voltaire didn't just write about the man in the Iron Mask, he weaponized the mystery, transforming a royal secret into a rallying cry against tyranny. When the philosopher first mentioned the prisoner in his letters, he didn't present it as gossip. He framed it as a deliberate act of cruelty by the Sun King. His choice of words was calculated. A man buried alive in velvet darkness, a soul erased by royal decree. This wasn't history, it was propaganda, and it worked. The mask became shorthand for the monarchy's worst excesses, a tangible symbol of Louis XIV's willingness to crush dissent without trial or reason. But Voltaire's genius lay in what he left unsaid. By refusing to name the prisoner, he turned every reader into a detective, inviting them to imagine the worst. Was the captive a rival heir, a betrayed lover, a witness to some unspeakable royal crime? The ambiguity was the point. Enlightenment salons buzzed with theories, each more damning than the last, until the mask ceased to be about one man and became a metaphor for the entire ancient regime, a system that could vanish its enemies without explanation. The backlash was swift. French censors scrubbed references to the mask from official publications, but the harder they pressed, the more the legend spread. Pamphlets smuggled from Holland depicted Louis as a masked monster, hiding his tyranny behind divine right. Even the prisoner's alleged crimes shifted with the times. Early rumors suggested he'd insulted the king, but by the 1780s, revolutionaries claimed he'd exposed Louis's secret alliance with the Pope to suppress free thought. The irony, Voltaire likely knew the truth was mundane. Private letters suggest he'd heard whispers the prisoner was merely a troublesome nobleman, perhaps the Duke of Beaufort or a disgraced diplomat. But facts didn't serve his cause. By keeping the mystery alive, he gave the Enlightenment its most potent myth, proof that absolute power corrupts absolutely. When the Bastille fell, rioters didn't just chant for bread. They demanded answers about the faceless man who'd haunted France for a century. In the end, the mask's greatest power wasn't hiding a prisoner's identity. It was revealing the monarchy's darkest fear, that one day the people would stop believing its lies. The Tang dynasty never recovered from the horror of those empty cribs. Empress Wu Zetian's rise to power wasn't paved with diplomacy or battlefield victories. It was built on the tiny graves of her own children. Ancient court chronicles whisper of two infants, a daughter and a son, who died under suspicious circumstances just as Wu's rivals stood poised to topple her. The official records claim illness, but the timing was too perfect, the beneficiaries too obvious. This wasn't tragedy, it was political theater so brutal it rewrote the rules of Chinese succession forever. Wu's first alleged victim was her newborn daughter, smothered in her crib mere days after birth. Historians of the era note the chilling sequence. Wu had recently invited Emperor Gaozong's former empress, Lady Wang, to visit the nursery. When the child was found lifeless, Wu pointed the finger at her rival, accusing her of crushing the infant in a jealous rage. Lady Wang's protests meant nothing. She was swiftly deposed, her family exiled, and Wu took her place as empress. The speed of the verdict reeked of a staged performance, especially when court physicians later admitted the baby showed no signs of trauma. The second death was even more damning. Years later, Wu's son Prince Lai Hong, a popular heir who'd begun questioning his mother's authority, collapsed after sharing a meal with her. Palace scribes recorded his final moments, convulsions, foaming at the mouth, his eyes locked on Wu as she calmly summoned priests instead of physicians. Poison was the unspoken verdict, but no investigation followed. Instead, Wu elevated her younger son, a pliable boy who wouldn't challenge her growing dominance. The genius of Wu's scheme lay in its plausibility. Infant mortality was common in 7th century China, and royal children were often pawns in factional wars. By weaponizing motherhood itself, she turned maternal grief into a political shield. When ministers dared accuse her, she wept before the court, clutching her remaining children like a wounded lioness. The performance worked too well. Later historians debate whether she truly committed filicide or simply exploited natural deaths with breathtaking cynicism. But the fallout was undeniable. Wu's rivals didn't just lose power, they were erased. Lady Wang's name was chiseled from monuments, her relatives purged from the bureaucracy. Prince Lai Hong's supporters confessed to treason under torture, their executions clearing Wu's path to become China's only female emperor. Even the Tang dynasty's meticulous record keepers faltered, their accounts of the infant deaths riddled with contradictions, as if the truth was too dangerous to commit to paper. Modern forensic analysis raises unsettling questions. Toxicology studies of Tang-era poisons reveal that mercury-laced longevity pills Wu favored could mimic heart failure in young adults. And the burial site of her daughter, archaeologists found it conspicuously empty, the tiny coffin filled with stones instead of bones. Whether murderer or master manipulator, Wu proved one brutal truth. In the Game of Thrones, even a mother's love could be sharpened into a dagger. Wu Zetian's inner court wasn't just a seat of power. It was a slaughterhouse dressed in silk. Behind the lacquered screens and gilded corridors, officials who pried too deeply into her affairs didn't simply fall from grace. They vanished without a trace, their bodies often found months later in shallow graves outside the capital, their tongues removed and their faces unrecognizable. These weren't just executions, they were performances designed to paralyze dissent with terror. One minister, Pei Yan, made the fatal mistake of questioning her decision to elevate a lover to the imperial guard. Days later, he was summoned to a private audience, a rare honor. Witnesses described him leaving the throne room unharmed, even smiling. By dawn, his entire household had been arrested on fabricated treason charges. The official record states he committed suicide in custody, but palace servants whispered of a far darker end. He'd been sealed alive inside a bronze statue of a guardian lion, left to suffocate at the palace gates as a warning to others. The sheer scale of the disappearances revealed a chilling system. Wu employed a network of secret police called the Laughing Tigers, named for their habit of grinning as they dragged victims away. Their methods were grotesquely inventive. One general who criticized her Buddhist patronage was found with his skin flayed, his corpse arranged in a lotus position. Another, a censor who uncovered her embezzlement from the military treasury, was fed to starving dogs in the palace kennels, except the animals had been trained to only attack on command. The message was clear: even in death, your suffering served the empress's will. Yet the most unsettling disappearances weren't the bloody ones. Some officials simply never returned from routine palace meetings. Their families received urns filled with ashes, but court astrologers noted an eerie pattern. These men had all been investigating the same thing: the suspicious fires that destroyed records of Wu's early years. A librarian who'd smuggled out a surviving scroll was found with his hands burned to stumps, the document itself reduced to cinders in his clenched fists. Wu didn't just kill her enemies, she erased their very memory. When the father of a disappeared scholar dared to mourn publicly, she had his ancestral shrine demolished and his family name struck from the imperial exams. Even grieving became a crime. The effect was so profound that decades later, historians struggled to document her reign, not because evidence didn't exist, but because those who'd witnessed the truth had been systematically silenced. The Ghost Palace's legacy wasn't just in the bodies it claimed, but in the fear it seared into survivors. Officials developed a habit of carrying personal seals with hollow compartments, hiding poison pills for a quick death if the Laughing Tigers came. Some began writing memoirs in code, burying them in garden courtyards, and on quiet nights servants reported hearing phantom footsteps in empty corridors, not the tread of the living, but the shuffling gait of the vanished, still walking the halls where they'd been murdered. Wu's greatest power wasn't her ruthlessness, it was her ability to turn a palace of gold into a tomb where even whispers dared not escape. Mary Stuart's downfall wasn't just plotted in dungeons, it was sealed with a love letter. The infamous casket letters, a trove of passionate missives allegedly penned by the Scottish Queen to her third husband, the Earl of Bothwell, became the smoking gun that branded her an adulteress and murderess. But here's the twist: historians still debate whether these damning documents were genuine confessions or masterful forgeries designed to destroy her. The letters' contents were explosive. One described a midnight rendezvous just days after her second husband Lord Darnley's mysterious murder. Another spoke of a secret wedding while her court believed her a grieving widow. When her enemies produced them in front of Elizabeth I's tribunal, the verdict was inevitable. Mary wasn't just guilty of poor judgment, she'd orchestrated her own ruin. Yet the real scandal lies in the shadows between the lines. The letters surfaced under suspicious circumstances, discovered in a silver casket by Scottish nobles who'd already rebelled against Mary. No originals survive, only copies transcribed by her accusers, riddled with inconsistencies. Some passages mirrored phrases from French sonnets popular at court, as if stitched together from fragments. Others contained bizarre errors, like references to events that occurred after the dates on the letters themselves. The most damning note, signed, "Your most faithful and affectionate wife," used a French phrase Mary rarely employed in authenticated correspondence. The timing reeked of a setup. Bothwell, a brute with a history of coercion, had allegedly abducted Mary. Though rumors swirled she'd gone willingly, the letters painted their union as a torrid affair, but legal records suggest something darker. A queen trapped by a lover's blackmail, forced into marriage to protect her throne. When Mary miscarried twins months later, her captors dismissed it as divine punishment. Elizabeth's role in the charade was particularly chilling. She privately doubted the letters' authenticity, yet publicly weaponized them, knowing they justified keeping Mary imprisoned. By the time Mary fled to England seeking refuge, the legend of her crimes had ossified into fact. Her trial wasn't about evidence, it was about narrative. The letters, whether real or fabricated, served their purpose, turning a queen into a cautionary tale, proving that in politics, the truth mattered less than the story that stuck. Mary's final plea, "Look to your consciences," fell on deaf ears. The letters had done their work, erasing her humanity until all that remained was the caricature of a lustful, murderous monarch. Even her execution became a staged spectacle, with the severed head held aloft not just as proof of death, but as a warning. No secret, however carefully coded, stays buried when empires demand a villain. And so the woman who once ruled 2 kingdoms became a footnote in her own tragedy, her voice drowned out by the rustle of parchment and the whispers of men who'd already written her ending. What these 25 secrets reveal isn't just the darkness behind the crown, it's the terrifying fragility of power itself. Monarchy, for all its pomp and gold-leaf grandeur, has always been a performance, a delicate illusion of divine authority propped up by whispers, lies, and sometimes blood. Every vanished prince, every forged letter, every poisoned chalice exposes the same truth. Thrones are far less stable than they appear, and the moment people stop believing in the fairy tale, the walls start to crumble. Think about it, Louis XVII's disappearance didn't just haunt France, it became a weapon, proof that revolutions don't just topple kings, they leave behind ghosts that generations can't escape. Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a blueprint for how to erase a woman from history with a single, brutal narrative. And Rasputin. His murder didn't save the Romanovs, it exposed their desperation, proving that even the most sacred dynasties could be undone by the right scandal at the wrong time. These weren't isolated incidents, they were stress tests for entire systems of power, moments when the mask slipped and the world glimpsed the raw, messy humanity behind the throne. And if history teaches us anything, it's that the cycle never really ends. Today's royal scandals, the leaked emails, the tell-all interviews, the whispered rumors of betrayal aren't just tabloid fodder. They're the same seismic tremors that once rattled Versailles and the Winter Palace, playing out on social media instead of in shadowed corridors. So here's the question that should keep you up at night. Which of today's royal secrets will be the ones historians dissect a century from now? Which whispered affair, which contested inheritance, which sudden disappearance might someday unravel a monarchy we assume is unshakable? The answer's already hiding in plain sight, in the headlines we scroll past, the documentaries we binge, the comment sections buzzing with theories. History doesn't repeat itself, but it always rhymes. And if you've learned anything from these 25 explosive secrets, it's that the next royal scandal capable of shaking a kingdom isn't a matter of if, it's when. So keep watching, keep questioning, and most of all, keep remembering that behind every crown, there's a vault of secrets just waiting for the right moment to explode. If this journey through history's darkest royal secrets left you hungry for more, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the conversation below. Which modern monarchy do you think is sitting on the next powder keg? Drop your predictions in the comments, because if there's one thing we know about royal scandals, it's that the truth is always stranger than the storybooks.